And now for something completely different, because my eyes, not as healed as I thought they were. But, welcome back to MysHistory and the conclusion of the Mary Surratt series. And if you've missed any of the previous episodes and you want to get caught up, then I will link them in the description box and also somewhere up here in a card on the screen. So now, let's get into the conclusion of Mary Surratt. So, you'll all remember, just a quick rundown, right? Mary would marry a man named John Surratt Sr. They would have 3 children, Isaac, Anna, and John Surratt Jr. They lived in Surrattsville, Maryland, which is present-day Clinton. When the Civil War broke out, Maryland would remain a part of the Union. The Surratts were Confederate sympathizers. They would host fellow sympathizers at their tavern, which they also used as a safe house for Confederate spies. Isaac would go to Texas to join the Confederate Army. John Jr. would become a courier. John Sr. would die sometime after the war started, and after the death of her husband, Mary would rent out the tavern in Surrattsville to a man by the name of John Lloyd, and then she would take possession of the family's townhome in D.C., which she converted into a boarding house, and the first boarder would be Louis Weichmann, who was an old school chum of John Jr. For the Confederate spies, the most traveled route from Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and Montreal, led through both Surrattsville and Washington, D.C., where Mary owned property in both places. And it's up for debate how much John Lloyd actually knew about any of the guests or the people that stayed at the tavern or the inn. Mary would be introduced to John Wilkes Booth in January of 1865. They would fast develop a very close bond. Mary would become a confidant to Booth. They shared a common hatred of Lincoln, the Union, and the abolitionist movement. Her boarding house would also become a safe house for Confederate activity. Booth would spend his days, according to witness testimony, at the house speaking with either John Jr. or Mary, sometimes for really long periods of time. In March of 1865, John Jr., George Atzerodt, and David Harold would hide weapons, ammunition, and other supplies in the walls and floorboards of the Surratt Tavern in preparation of the plot to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, which we all know fell apart when Lincoln changed his plans that day. This would result in Samuel Arnold finding work in Virginia, and Michael O'Laughlen would return to Baltimore. John Jr. would return to his courier duties, and Booth would shift gears and start to plot the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So if you watched part 7, you knew about all the arrests of all of the conspirators, and the trial for all of them would start on May 9th, 1865, and Mary would be tried with the other conspirators that were arrested: Louis Payne, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlen, Dr. Samuel Mudd, and Edmund Spangler. The case would be heard before a military tribunal rather than in a civil court. I'm going to focus on some of the testimony for Mary and not the others. So, we'll go back to April 2nd, when Mary asked Weichmann to go to the National Hotel to find Booth, saying that she needed to speak with him, and that if he were not there, then Weichmann should find Atzerodt. So Weichmann would find Atzerodt. Atzerodt would then have a private meeting with Mary while Weichmann waited outside with the horses. April 3rd of 1865, John Jr. would arrive at the boarding house, unaware that Richmond had fallen and the Confederacy had been lost, and he didn't believe Weichmann when Weichmann told him. John would then exchange some of the gold that he had for cash and continue with his rebel activities, leaving for Montreal on the morning of April 4th. On April 11th, Mary asked Weichmann to contact Booth to borrow his carriage for a trip to Surrattsville. Booth, having sold his carriage, would give Weichmann $10 to rent one. Mary would then ask Weichmann to accompany to Surrattsville, saying that she needed to collect a debt owed to her by John Lloyd. On this way to Surrattsville, Weichmann and Mary would pass John Lloyd. Lloyd and Mary would have a conversation that Weichmann didn't hear, but Lloyd would testify that Mary told him to have the shooting irons ready. And up until that conversation, Lloyd said he had forgotten about the items stashed in the walls and floorboards of the tavern. Weichmann would further testify that after her secret conversation with Lloyd that day, she would yell out to a woman named Emma Offutt, who was the sister-in-law of John Lloyd, that she, Mary, was going to help secure the release of Augustus Howell, who was a Confederate spy and courier who had been arrested at her tavern and imprisoned. On April 14th, 1865, Booth would come to the boarding house and have a secret meeting with Mary, where he gave her a package to deliver to the tavern. So Mary would have Weichmann bring her again to Surrattsville, saying that she needed to collect a debt. Mary would then ask a man named Bennett Gwynn to deliver a note to Nothey, and once the letter left with Gwynn, Mary would take the package inside the tavern and ask where Lloyd was, and then would be told that he was in Marlborough, which was 2 hours away from Surrattsville. Lloyd would then arrive as Mary was deciding to leave, and he had supplies for the tavern that he started to unload. Gwynn testified that he saw Lloyd in Marlborough earlier on April 14th and that he appeared to have been drinking. And when Mary's attorney asked if Lloyd seemed considerably intoxicated, Gwynn replied, "I could hardly tell that. He acted like a man who had been drinking some." I don't know. Mary then would take the package that Booth had given her to the back of the tavern where Lloyd was. And when she was leaving, she would say to him, "Well, Mr. Lloyd, I want you to have those shooting irons ready. There will be parties here tonight who will call for them." She further instructed him to have the package from Booth and 2 bottles of whiskey ready, as they would also be called for that night. In various testimony giving to discredit Lloyd, witnesses would say that he had been drinking. One witness testified that he actually had drinks with Lloyd in Marlborough, and the two would return to Surrattsville. And like I said, Marlborough was 2 hours away from Surrattsville, and according to the witness, Lloyd was in full control of his horse and buggy and was not drinking on the ride home. It's a 2-hour ride, depending on how much I guess he drank in Marlborough. He probably wasn't that drunk. Mary and Weichmann would return to D.C. around 8:30 at night on April 14th, where a large Union victory celebration was starting. And Mary would comment, "I am afraid all this rejoicing will be turned into mourning and all this glory into sadness." Weichmann dropped Mary off at the boarding house. He returned to the horse and the buggy, and then the two of them would have a late dinner at the boarding house. Around 9 o'clock that night, a knock was heard on the second floor entrance, which Mary would answer. Weichmann could not hear the conversation, nor did he know who the visitor was, but he assumed it to be the final visit from Booth for that day, which I suppose is very, very possible because the boarding house was located only a half a mile from Ford's Theater. This would have been enough time for Booth to have a visit with Mary and then arrive to the theater at 9:30. He apparently visited the house several times a day, according to testimony from Weichmann. During the trial, Mary's defense would call Captain Cottingham to the stand. He was the officer who helped to arrest and interrogate John Lloyd. It was during his testimony that Cottingham would state that Lloyd finally broke down, saying that he feared for his life and that if he were to tell the truth, he feared he would be killed by the other conspirators, namely Booth, Harold, the Surratts, and Atzerodt. Cottingham would go on to say that during the interrogation of Lloyd would state that Mary had come to the tavern on the afternoon of April 14th and told him to have the guns and other items ready to be picked up. Lloyd would further state that Booth and Harold would arrive at the tavern around midnight and demand the items Mary told him to have ready, but he stated that one of the firearms had remained hidden due to Booth's leg injury, as he would need both of his hands to hold the horse. And if you've never ridden a horse, you got to grip it with your legs in order to stay on top. And you've got an injured leg, you got to hold on for dear life, apparently. It's not apparently. That's what you have to do. Lloyd said, "Oh, Mrs. Surratt, that vile woman, she has ruined me. I am to be shot. I am to be shot." According to Cottingham, that's what Lloyd said the day they went to arrest him. Mary was charged with abetting, aiding, concealing, counseling, and harboring her co-defendants. Attempts to find counsel for her and the others was difficult, as attorneys feared being accused of disloyalty to the Union should they accept the job. Mary would retain attorney Reverdy Johnson, and this would be challenged by a member of the military commission, as Johnson objected to requiring loyalty oaths from voters in the 1864 election. Those concerns would be dismissed. Johnson would appear to give up on defending Mary after the first week of testimony, which included statements by Weichmann and Lloyd. And after then, he would routinely be absent, and so most of her case would be handled by two other less experienced attorneys, Frederick Aiken and John Wesley Clampett. Not like the Beverly Hillbillies. The fact that Mary remained quiet, even in meetings with her attorneys, did not help her. So according to my friend, who is the distant relative of Mary Surratt, he said her silence may have been due to her not wanting to give up her son in the kidnapping plot, or to give up any of the other conspirators. Maybe she had more to hide. At one point, as Aiken was questioning Captain Wormerskirch about the night of Mary's arrest, Wormerskirch would state that Mary requested him to wait a while, and she knelt and prayed a little. He then further added, "She knelt down, but whether she prayed or not, I cannot say." And this would have the courtroom fill with some laughter, which would cause Mary, typically face hidden by a black veil, to turn quickly around for a moment, and for an instant her veil was thrown aside, displaying a pair of flashing eyes, according to somebody that was sitting in the court. Once the prosecution rested, Aiken would then call a line of priests in to testify to Mary's piety as a good Christian woman who could not possibly have been involved in such a plot. 3 priests would be called, and each would say that they knew Mary, but none of them could say that they knew her well, nor if she was loyal to the Union. Eliza Houlihan would be called by Aiken. She was a one-time boarder at the boarding house with her husband and their 2 children. They're the family that moved out the day before Mary would be arrested. So April 16th, 1865, they would move out of the boarding house. Aiken would ask her about Lewis Payne showing up at the boarding house, posing as Reverend Wood, and Eliza testified that while she found him odd, he was understood to be a friend of the Surratts, and she felt it inappropriate to ask any questions. Eliza would also testify to George Atzerodt showing up at the boarding house, but she knew him only as port tobacco, and knew that he was not welcome in the house, according to Mary, which confused Eliza, given the number of times he came to the house. When Aiken asked of Atzerodt, did he spend most of the time when he came there in the company of Miss Surratt? And Eliza would answer yes. He would ask for John Surratt, and if he was not there, he would inquire for Mrs. Surratt. And you'll recall that Mary, on the night of her arrest, she claimed poor eyesight, and that's why she didn't recognize Payne. Well, Eliza would be asked about Mary's poor eyesight, and Eliza would state that she never saw Mary read or sew by candlelight. However, when cross-examined, Eliza would state that Mrs. Surratt never appeared to have difficulty recognizing people by gaslight in the parlor. This would be backed up by testimony from another witness, Nora Fitzpatrick. Nora would further add that there had always been a photo of Booth in Mary's room, and this would be the photo that they found hidden behind another photo on the night of April 17th, when they again searched the house and arrested Mary, the other ladies, and Payne. John Jr. did have an on and off girlfriend named Anna, and she testified that she had given a stack of letters from John postmarked in Montreal to Mary prior to the investigators coming to the house in the early morning hours of April 15th after the assassination. What happened to those letters was unknown to her, as they were not found in the boarding house when investigators returned on April 17th, 1865, and to this day, no one knows whatever happened to those letters, but given there was that other couple of days, the investigators came, they waited a couple of days and came back, I'm sure it's possible that Mary could have gotten rid of quite a bit of stuff that could have incriminated her. Aiken would then again call in a line of priests to testify again to Mary's pietous nature, much to the frustration and consternation of the court and the spectators. Again, they would say that they knew Mary, but they did not know her character or her loyalty to the Union. Yawn. He would then call a local shopkeeper to testify to the good character of Mary. Unfortunately, the shopkeeper said he couldn't vouch for Mary, stating, "It is only as a customer that I know her." I mean, he was trying. He tried. Aiken would then call John Nothey to the stand to inquire about the debt that he owed to Mary for land that he had purchased from her late husband. Now, he did state that he owed her money and that he did receive her letter, again asking for payment, as she had a debt owed to a man by the name of Mr. Calvert in D.C. He testified that he didn't see her on April 14th, 1865, when she came to Surrattsville and had Mr. Gwynn deliver the letter to him. And I suppose this was an attempt to show that Mary had legitimate business in Surrattsville, and therefore the days that she was there could be easily explained, except that on April 14th, when she wrote in her letter to Mr. Nothey about the money, she gave him additional time to pay her. And she was delivering a package for Booth, and she was telling Mr. Lloyd to have items ready for pickup on April 14th. Augustus Howell, the guy that she was going to try and get out of prison, he would be called to the stand by Aiken. He was the guy that was arrested at the tavern in March of 1865 for being a Confederate spy and a blockade runner. Apparently, he was a frustration to authorities while he was imprisoned at Old Capitol the previous spring. He did not know all of the details of the kidnapping plot, and he was not at all involved in the assassination plot. He was, however, smart enough to understand that throwing Mary under the bus or any of the other conspirators would gain him very little. Howell would testify to knowing the Surratts for about a year and a half. He had even at one point stayed at Mary's boarding house in February. This is where he met Weichmann, and Howell would testify that it was Weichmann who was a sympathizer to the South, and he wanted to go to Richmond, not to study theology, as he said, but to join the rebel government. And he would further state that Weichmann gave him information about Confederate prisoners in Union prisons, which the Confederacy likely already knew about with the kidnapping plot to exchange Lincoln for said prisoners. This tactic to discredit Weichmann would backfire, as Weichmann had a bit of evidence regarding studying theology in Richmond despite the war. That was his plan. That's where he was going to do. So Howell's testimony did little to sway the court, as he was a man of dubious character, and it can't be said that the defense was much better due to the fact that they did not elect to bring into court the fact that he had been arrested for blockade running. That fact would come out on cross-examination by the tribunal. Whoops. Even more damning was that Howell would seemingly recall his conversations with Weichmann oh so clearly, yet he could barely recall a single conversation with Mary. Anna Surratt would be called to testify, and she would claim that it was Weichmann who introduced the conspirators to the house and met with them, not her mother. She would further state that her mother's eyesight was so poor that she couldn't even see friends on the street, nor could she read or sew by gaslight at night. Yet she was able to recognize Lloyd on the trip to Surrattsville on April 11th, 1865. That's curious. During direct examination, Anna would become agitated and start to cry out, "Where's Mama?" Not wanting the ladies the ability to exchange knowing glances or any kind of signs, a guard was placed in front of Mary in the prisoner's box. Anna would go on to become more agitated. The questioning was stopped. The judges on the tribunal chose not to do a cross-examination of her as they felt that her state was too fragile and that she had been through so much. In fact, Anna had been in prison since the night of April 17th, 1865, and had not seen her mother since April 30th, which was 1 month before her testimony. Anna would be released from prison. She had no family, no home, no money. She would stay for a time with family in Prince George's County, but she couldn't be away from her mother. It really broke her up to be away from her mother. So some accommodating friends would allow her to stay with them in D.C., where she would then spend the remainder of the trial sitting behind her mother. The case was lengthy, as one would imagine, trying all of the defendants at the same time. Now, arguments were made about the case being in a military tribunal and not a civil court, as it was peacetime. And each time it was brought up, it was dismissed. The reason was, in 1865, there was a feeling that the South was involved in the assassination and the conspiracy was more widespread. D.C. was still considered a war zone with Confederate troops still in the field, and it was argued that assassination was an act of war. Unlike civil court, the defendants were not permitted to speak on their own behalf. The case would end on June 28th, and the deliberation and verdicts would be swift. Mary Surratt, Louis Payne, George Atzerodt, and David Harold would all be sentenced to death for their roles in the conspiracy. Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlen, and Dr. Samuel Mudd would be sentenced to life in prison. Dr. Mudd only escaped the death penalty by 1 vote. It was believed that O'Laughlen was assigned to assassinate General Ulysses S. Grant, and that's why he was back in D.C. on the night of the assassination of Lincoln. But, like Atzerodt, he would have second thoughts and get drunk instead. Edmund Spangler would be sentenced to 6 years in prison. Mary, Payne, Atzerodt, and Harold would be hanged July 7th, 1865, with Mary being the first woman to be executed by the federal government. An outbreak of yellow fever would come to Fort Jefferson, where the remaining prisoners were being held, in August of 1867. Dr. Mudd, with the assistance of Spangler, would treat those who caught it. Michael O'Laughlen would die of the disease in September of 1867. On March 1st, 1869, President Johnson would pardon Spangler, Dr. Mudd, and Samuel Arnold, and they would be released from prison. After the death of her mother, Anna would be alone. John was still in hiding in 1865. Isaac was still away, far, far away, having left to fight for the Confederacy. She could not bear to live in the boarding house. For the next few years, she would live with friends. The boarding house had been mortgaged by her mother to pay legal fees, and that would be sold in November of 1867. The property in Surrattsville was sold in March of 1869. Anna would eventually marry on June 17th, 1869, in a private ceremony at St. Patrick's Church in D.C., with both of her brothers in attendance, as Isaac had returned from the war. Anna and her husband would move to Baltimore near her brothers. She would go on to have children and die of kidney disease in 1904. Isaac had returned from the war. He was unaware of the death of his mother until years later because he was in Europe. He would live in Baltimore near his family. He never married, and he would die of indigestion in 1907. And I know you're thinking, how on earth did John end up free? Well, he was tried in a civil court 18 months after Mary's execution. This had to do with the case Ex parte Milligan, declaring the trial of civilians before a military tribunal was unconstitutional if civilian courts were open. The trial was 2 months long, and in the case, it was admitted that, John had been a part of the kidnapping plot, but not the assassination plot. The trial ended in a mistrial, and due to the statute of limitations having run out on all the charges except murder, John was released on bail. He would give a lecture on December 6, 1870, admitting his involvement in the kidnapping plot, but maintained that he knew nothing of the assassination plot. He would come to revile Louis Weichmann, calling him a perjurer responsible for his mother's death. John would get married in 1872, have 7 children, and die of pneumonia in 1916. As for Louis Weichmann, he would move to Anderson, Indiana, start a business, and then become a controversial and sometimes ostracized person by people due to lingering doubts as to the truth and his motives in the trial. There was backlash against him for his testimony that allowed for the first woman to be executed by the federal government. Prior to his death, he swore an affidavit affirming that all his testimony about the assassination was completely true. He would die in 1902 and be buried under the original spelling of his last name. Now, according to my friend, quote, "Most of the stories I heard growing up were conspiracy theories about Mary, as she was hung for the situation and didn't sell anyone out, which made it appear that she had much more to hide. So over generations, the story grew, and it was assumed that she was a bigger part than we see on record, and her silence was to either protect the movement and army operatives or simply to protect her son. Descendants of Mary Surratt have since changed the spelling of their last name." I know this has been a really long one, and not that it has not been interesting. And there is so much more that I could have gone into. But at the end of the day, if you want to know more of the particulars of the case, I'd recommend the book, The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln by Kate Clifford Larson. And I will also link this really amazing website. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. I just discovered it the other day. I'll link that down in the description box. It goes through day-by-day trial, all of the witness testimony, diary stuff from some of the people that were in attendance. It was really fascinating. And if you're a history nerd like me, you'd probably love it. So, I'm thinking my red swollen eyes will add to what I have coming up in October as far as makeup goes. So, I'll be working on that to get a couple of episodes up next month. And I hope that you will join me for any future videos. And if you like this content, then give it a thumbs up. And please consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts on all of this down in the comments below. And what do you think I should talk about next? Anyway, have a great day. And I will see you next time. Bye.